Hello and welcome to EE 333. I'm your instructor, Gregory Myers. In this particular example, we're going to take a look at one way to create our export XML, the XML that we will ideally use to save it to the file system for persistent storage or potentially stream it to another application. For this particular example, we're actually going to do the XML manually. And so there's going to be a little bit of hard coding in this. In a later video, we'll take a look at alternatives using the Java framework, some of the built-in functions in there for serialization and deserialization. But for this example, we are simply just going to create the XML by hand, essentially. To help us with this, I've created a sample file to sort of provide us some guidance. The advantage of XML over a custom format is that it more clearly identifies the data fields by encapsulating them in an open and closed tag. If you see here, for instance, the ID has an open ID, meaning that it has a tag that indicates that the data coming after it is the ID. And then once that section of data is complete, then there's a closed tag. And this is very easy to parse, as you're going to see later on in our import XML function. The other thing to notice here is that XML tags can be nested. And so what I've done here is I've nested all of our fields inside of a user tag. In this case, so we have just a single user per file. You would ultimately have another level of nesting if you had multiple users in a file. And then the very last thing that we want to take a look at here then is the first line in the file that essentially, it's technically optional because since we are writing the import and the export functions, but we wouldn't necessarily need this. However, though, the first line in the file does indicate what the type of data is in the file and can be used in other applications as well. The other comment to make is we could either use a lowercase or an uppercase U for our application. It's not essential, just as long as you're consistent. And in this case, what I'd like to do is make a quick change here. I'm actually going to change this to a capital U just so that it matches with our class name. All right, so continuing on with this, then the first step that we want to do is much like in our export custom, we want to go ahead and declare a output string. And we want to initialize it to an empty set of quotes. And then what we'll do is we'll start building our output string. The first piece of the output string that we're interested in is going to be this document header, if you would. The main thing to note here is that we're doing this manually, and we will discover there are other ways of building the XML document. And then we, of course, want to go ahead and add the new line here on the end. But the other distinct advantage of XML is that it doesn't require that new line. The white space outside of the tags is essentially for human consumption, for human readability. So this could theoretically all be on one line. But we're going to go ahead and include the new line here just for ease of being able to read and verify our results here. So we're going to go ahead and say output then is going to be equal to, and we're going to follow this up now with the user tag, which essentially indicates that the data coming after that is going to be part of a user object. Once again, I'm going to go ahead and include a new line. A good habit when exporting or writing code to export XML is whenever you open a tag, just to go ahead and get in the habit of closing a tag. Continuing on with that, if you'll notice we have white space here that indicates a tab that excuse me, is technically optional, once again, because of the white space is not necessarily necessary in XML. We will go ahead and include it here. So we'll say output plus equals, and then I'm going to include the tab as well as the tag here that indicates the ID and the data associated with it, which in this case is going to be this.id. And then we close our ID tag, and then we follow this all with the new line. Once again, the new line in the tab is completely optional. It's for the humans. We can continue this pattern then for each one of our fields. As a matter of fact, I'm just going to go ahead and do a copy and paste here to speed this up a little bit. This is the part of the video where you may want to consider just moving forward or pausing and then verifying that you've got this right at the end. Continuing on here, there's going to be the first name, the last name, and once again, if you see the pattern, then this is essentially just a quick exercise in making sure that you get all of your fields dealt with here. So any of the data that you want to export and keep some sort of persistent storage or stream to another application. City. As well as the state. And then lastly, our status. Now, the one final comment regarding our status, like in the export custom, we need to explicitly state the toString method here to indicate that we're getting the string value, the named value, not the numerical value, but also in XML, you can actually define then what is a valid element. So in this particular case, you could actually give a range of values for the status. Now, we aren't going to do that in this particular case, but we are simply going to export the status then as a string so that we can import it using our import XML. And then the very last step, of course, is then just simply to return the output. Hopefully you found this video helpful. As always, if you've got any questions or suggestions, don't hesitate to reach out to me.